So today we're going to be moving on in our homeostasis notes. And today we're going to be focusing on excretion, which is the removal of waste. So as we have in the other life functions, we're going to start by just talking about why excretion is necessary. And we'll talk about how different types of organisms accomplish the removal of waste. And we'll focus on how humans remove waste through the various body systems, and then we'll finish up by talking about some of the diseases or malfunctions of the excretory system. So excretion, as I said, is the removal of wastes, and it's the removal of the cellular wastes that are released during metabolism when foods are digested and broken down, when compounds are transformed. Um, some of the products of those chemical reactions produce waste products that have to be removed from the organism. Also included here under excretion is osmoregulation, regulating the water balance of an organism. And that's something that we've been focusing on in the marathon runner activity that we've been doing. So some of the waste products that need to be excreted in organisms: excess water, carbon dioxide, which is produced often from cellular respiration, nitrogen wastes, which we'll talk about, salts and different ions produced from various metabolic processes. All these things need to be removed from the organism, otherwise there's the risk of them becoming toxic. So one important type of waste is nitrogenous wastes. And if you remember back to when we talked about biochemistry, that the main class of large molecules that contains nitrogen are the proteins. Okay. Proteins are made of amino acids, and amino acids have that amino group. Okay. And the amino group, when an amino acid is going to be broken down to be used for energy or some other purpose, that amino group needs to be disposed of. That process is called deamination. So for example, if a person's on a high protein diet and doesn't have a whole lot of carbs to burn as energy, their body may switch to using proteins, and part of that process is stripping off that amino group, deaminating the amino acids, and then those nitrogen groups need to be disposed of. And that's one reason, for example, that sometimes people with kidney trouble are advised not to adopt a high protein style diet, because the kidneys need to work to excrete those excess nitrogen wastes. So that nitrogen waste can be transformed into a variety of compounds for excretion. And this table has a list of some of the common ones: ammonia, urea, uric acid. So we'll talk about each of them. So ammonia, NH3, is very toxic in many living organisms. And in order to remove nitrogen waste as in the form ammonia, requires a lot of water. Ammonia is soluble in water, but that ammonia needs to be diluted with quite a bit of water to ensure that it's not toxic to the organism. So often what we see is that aquatic organisms are adapted to removing nitrogen waste in the form of ammonia. Things like Protist, invertebrates, and some fish. Because they live in the water and typically have plenty of water available, they can excrete the ammonia with that water. Another form is urea. So urea, it's not as toxic as ammonia. It's less toxic. It also therefore requires less water to be removed. It's soluble in water. And so many organisms will remove urea. Things like mammals, amphibians, earthworms, and most other land animals do not actually excrete nitrogen waste through urea. Many of them excrete nitrogen waste through uric acid. Uric acid is it's not very toxic, but it's also insoluble in water, and so therefore organisms that have to conserve water might ingest uric acid in their feces as a way of getting rid of that nitrogen waste. Insects, for example, and birds. Humans release some uric acid as well, adult reptiles. So there are all different forms of materials which can be used to excrete that nitrogen waste. So, as we said, aquatic organisms, Protist, bacteria, Hydra, they will excrete ammonia. It'll often just diffuse through the cell membrane. These are aquatic organisms. In plants typically recycle most of the waste products, and some of them can be stored in vacuoles, but often the majority of that waste is transformed into a form the plant can actually use. The invertebrates, the earthworm, for example, we've been talking about in each section. Earthworms secrete waste through such as ammonia and urea, and they have almost kidney-like structures. Okay, they're these tubules called the nephridia, and they're found in each segment. And what they do is they draw waste products and channel it to the outside, while at the same time the capillaries surrounding these nephridia can reabsorb materials that are still useful. In insects such as the grasshopper, Malpighian tubules are used for excretion, and the waste products are turned into uric acid, okay, which is then removed through the intestine along with feces. So these Malpighian tubules, you can see they're up here in the insect in the digestive tract, and what happens is salts, water, nitrogenous waste are taken from the blood, okay, or the body fluid, I should say, in these insects, and then transferred into the feces so that when the insect releases that feces through the rectum, the waste materials go with it. In humans, we have several organs that are important for excretion. The lungs, obviously, for the excretion of carbon dioxide, as well as water. If we think back to when we talked about gas exchange, the alveoli, the air sacs within the lungs, surrounded by capillaries, and waste products from the blood, such as carbon dioxide, diffuse into that air, which can then be exhaled through the lungs. Sweat glands. Sweat glands' main purpose is for thermoregulation, but sweat does contain waste materials as well. Most sweat is water, but there are also urea and salts are excreted in sweat or perspiration as well. The liver is an extremely important organ for detoxifying materials. This is where those amino groups of amino acids are stripped off, okay, and that nitrogen is formed into urea. Also, the liver helps to detoxify poisons from the blood, alcohol, heavy metals are detoxified by the liver. Also, red blood cells get recycled by the liver, produces bile and salts as well. Also, the liver is responsible for breaking down and deactivating hormones that have been produced in the blood. So the liver has sort of multi-part function. But the kidneys are really important organ of human excretion. They're part of what we call the urinary system, the system within a human that produces urine. And the kidneys work to take blood and excrete waste products and retain useful materials. So the kidneys help get rid of the urea and also to maintain homeostasis in terms of other things such as water, glucose, salts, ions, etc. The kidneys look exactly like a kidney bean, but larger. They're about 10 centimeters across. They're located in our back, in the dorsal part of our body, on each side of the spine. And inside of the kidneys, there are about 1 million units called nephrons that we're going to talk about here in a minute. But if we look at the entire system as a whole, we have 2 kidneys. And so those kidneys are supplied with blood from the circulatory system. Okay, so arterial blood is pumped to the kidneys, and then the filtered blood that is released goes back into veins to be put back into circulation. Those kidneys take the waste products, transform them into urine, which drips down through this long tube called the ureter. The ureter from each kidney connects to the urinary bladder, which stores the urine until it's ready to be released. When it is ready to be released, it leaves the body through the urethra. So the units that make up the kidney, that 1 million nephrons, have an important function. We'll talk about that function here. So the blood that's supplied to the kidneys comes through arteries, and it's forced into this structure of blood vessels, okay, called the glomerulus. And so the blood that's entering there is under high pressure because it's in the artery. And so that high pressure coming into this structure forces components of the blood out and into the structure of the nephron. Once that material is forced out of the blood, it's then called filtrate. Okay? And that filtrate doesn't contain the blood cells. They stay in blood, but it contains a mixture of water, salts, urea, glucose, amino acids, are all then in this filtrate, which is going to travel this pathway that's shown in yellow on this slide. Okay, this is the pathway of the nephron. It's made of a couple different sections. There's the proximal convoluted tubule, PCT, here. Then it has the straight section. This big loop is called the loop of Henle. Then there's this section, the distal convoluted tubule, which connects to a connecting duct, which brings the urine out of the body, or out into the ureter. And each of these little sections would be connected to another nephron. So obviously there's 1 million of these, so this is enlarged quite a bit. And so as the filtrate that's been forced out of the blood passes through this tube, what's happening is that along the way, the blood is reabsorbing useful materials from that filtrate. Glucose, for example, salts, and various other products are taken from that filtrate into the blood. It happens through diffusion and through active transport as well. Also, along the way, certain components from the blood are moved into the filtrate. Like we said, it makes its way back up, okay, and then eventually into these collecting ducts. So here in this diagram, you don't really need to know the details here, but what you see is that different materials are moving into and out of the filtrate as it's making its way along its pathway, okay, until eventually it forms urine. If we look at urine, it's 95% water, 2% urea, and then small amounts of other materials. You can see them all listed here. But the nephron and the kidney itself helps regulate and maintains the proper balance, okay, adjusting which materials are excreted and which are kept based on the conditions of the organism, of the human, of the person, in order to maintain homeostasis. Now, there are many malfunctions of the excretory system in humans. Kidney disease is a relatively common one, and in kidney disease, the kidneys are not functioning properly, and therefore there may be excess urea and salts in the blood if the kidneys aren't filtering them out. And that can lead to the buildup of these products, and that can lead to toxicity. In the early stage could lead to, weakness and lethargy, to all sorts of other symptoms, confusion, twitching, eventually can lead to coma. And so how well the kidneys work can be affected by lots of different factors. If a person has low blood pressure, the pressure of the blood coming into that glomerulus is not enough to force enough filtrate out, and therefore the kidneys are not filtering enough. High blood pressure can lead to damaging those structures of the nephron. Drugs, mercury, lead, infections, all sorts of things can interfere with the nephron's functioning. Physical damage can also be a concern. Another thing that you may have heard of are kidney stones. This is actually a picture of a pretty large kidney stone, almost a centimeter. Kidney stones form when minerals that are going through the urinary system crystallize. And so if they sort of crystallize and build up into a significant size, then they can block the movement of material through the nephron, through the collecting ducts. Can be extremely painful, because a kidney stone like this has to either break down or dissolve on its own, or, which it typically doesn't happen, or it has to be released through the urethra. And 1 centimeter stone moving through a relatively narrow urethra can be quite painful. Gout is another disease you may have heard of. This is caused by uric acid building up and producing crystals, which leads to painful joints. Used to be called the rich man's disease, and different types of food can increase the likelihood of a person getting gout. If kidneys fail, then that's a serious malfunction. But one kidney, so one fully functioning kidney, can do all of the work that needs to be done in a person. A person can live just fine with one kidney. It can excrete all the necessary wastes. But without any functioning kidneys, or with kidneys that have been reduced in terms of their functioning, that can be a dangerous situation. And so kidney transplants are possible. Sometimes a person could get a donated kidney from a living person, a relative, for example. And so if a relative donates a kidney, then the person that receives the kidney can have one working kidney. The person that donated the kidney will still have their other healthy kidney left, and they can both live fine with a single kidney. When a person does get a transplant, like a kidney or any other organ, typically they need to be on long-term immunosuppressant drugs, which lowers their immune system, because when we transplant organs, often the body will recognize the transplanted organs as foreign, and the immune system will then attack those organs. And so when a person gets an organ transplant, they're typically put on drugs which lowers their immune system to prevent that from happening. Until a person that has kidney failure can get a transplanted kidney, you can also transplant a kidney from a person that is deceased. So if a person, for example, died in a car accident or something, has donated organs, a kidney can be taken from that person and transplanted into somebody that is in need. If a person's in kidney failure but has not been able to get a transplanted kidney yet, there is a machine. It's called dialysis machine, which basically acts as an artificial kidney, where a person goes to the doctor's office and is hooked up to this machine, which basically blood runs through tubes into this machine, which filters the blood and then puts it back into the person's body. Excuse me. And that process can help keep them alive until they're able to get a more permanent solution of a transplanted kidney. There are other malfunctions of the excretory system. Urinary tract infections are very common. This is when a bacteria gets into the urethra, the bladder, in the ureter possibly, and that leads to an infection, which can be dangerous if it were not treated. Urinary tract infections are more common in women, and that's because the length of the urethra is much shorter in women, and therefore it's easier for bacteria to make their way into the bladder. If there's failure in the liver, it's another important malfunction because, as we said earlier, the liver does a whole host of things for us. If there's an infection in the liver, if cancer develops in the liver, or if it's been damaged due to alcohol abuse, then as the liver starts to weaken in its function, waste products build up, and it can lead to a whole host of physical effects that can be damaging and can be dangerous. And so it's important that the liver is functioning correctly. All right, we're going to stop here for now. That's our notes